blood on the dust. That was the first thing the cowboy saw when he opened his eyes, though he couldn't tell if it was his or the man he had fallen fighting against. The night before, the moon had burned red over the plains, as if it were warning him, yet he hadn't listened. He had drawn his pistol, raised his knife, and thrown himself between an Apache woman and the drunken raiders who meant to take her life. 5 stabs, quick as lightning, had torn through his body before the world went black. The last thing he remembered was her cry, raw and wild, echoing against the canyon walls. And then nothing. When his eyelids fluttered open, he thought he was still dreaming. The scent of sagebrush and smoke filled his lungs. The stars overhead swirled faintly, and pain knifed through his chest like fire. He moved to touch his ribs, and his hand came back sticky and red. But before he could piece together whether he was alive or drifting into death's shadow, a sound struck him, a whisper, soft yet strong, carried on the wind. And then, standing above him, not one, but 3 figures cast shadows across his broken body. The first was the woman he had tried to save, her long dark hair falling across her face, her eyes like 2 embers burning in the night. But at her side were 2 others, taller, sterner, with braids tied with bone and feathers that swayed in the breeze. Their gazes bore down on him, unreadable, powerful, and he realized with a shiver that they were not just ordinary women. They stood as if carved from the very spirit of the desert itself. He had been willing to die for one, but now 3 looked upon him with a mix of judgment, sorrow, and something he could not name. The cowboy tried to sit up, and a cry of agony left his throat as the wounds in his body flared with heat. His vision blurred, but he caught the smallest movement. The first woman kneeling by his side, her hand pressing firmly over his bleeding chest. Her touch was cool, almost chilling, yet it slowed the fire raging inside him. He wanted to ask who the others were, what this meant, but words failed him. Instead, his breathing rasped out in shallow bursts, each one carrying him closer to the edge of darkness again. One of the women spoke, her voice steady, low, and haunting. It wasn't English, but the cowboy felt its meaning pierce him all the same. She seemed to be telling him to remain still, to surrender his fight, to let them do what must be done. He caught fragments of her words, as though they wove between the world of the living and the spirits beyond. The stars seemed to tilt, the earth to hum beneath him, and then he knew, whether he liked it or not, his fate was no longer in his own hands. The night deepened as the cowboy drifted between pain and strange visions. He felt himself pulled into a current beyond flesh and bone, as if the desert itself was whispering through the stars. Every time his eyelids sank shut, shadows rose around him, spirits of buffalo and wolves, thunder rolling like drums in the sky. But each time he thought he was slipping away, the women's presence pulled him back. It was as if their voices anchored him to the earth, binding him when his own body had given up. The Apache woman he had first saved leaned close to him, her hand steady, her eyes fierce. She murmured in her tongue, the words foreign but her tone soothing. At moments he thought he heard English pierce through, single words like live and fight. The other 2 women stood at his head and feet, chanting softly, their voices weaving together like a sacred rhythm. The air seemed to thrum, not just with sound but with power, something ancient and wild. His chest burned where the knife wounds had pierced him, but strangely, he no longer felt the sharp edge of death pressing in. Instead, there was a heat spreading from their hands, seeping through his ribs and belly, like fire crawling under his skin. He gritted his teeth, almost crying out, but the woman's touch pressed harder, commanding him to endure. This was no ordinary healing. This was something older, something men from the towns whispered about, but never understood. As dawn began to stain the horizon with pale light, he found himself strong enough to lift his head slightly. He saw the 3 women silhouetted in the early glow, their forms rigid, resolute. He whispered hoarsely, Why help me?" His voice cracked with dust and pain. For a long moment, no one answered. Then the woman he had bled for finally spoke, her voice soft but laced with steel. "You gave your blood for me. Now you carry more than your wounds. You carry our spirits too." Her words tangled in his mind, difficult to grasp. He wanted to ask again, to demand an explanation, but his strength faltered. The other women began to move around him, gathering herbs from small pouches, grinding them with stones, mixing them into pastes. One smeared the mixture across his chest wounds, the scent biting and bitter, making him cough. Another lifted a clay bowl to his lips, forcing him to drink something foul and earthy that burned all the way down. His body rejected it at first, but then warmth spread through him, dulling his agony. Through blurred vision, he caught sight of their faces. The first woman, the one who had cried when the knives struck him, watched him with something close to sorrow. The second, taller and sharper, held an expression that was unreadable, her eyes like flint, as if testing whether he was worthy of the life they were giving back. The third was younger, gentler, her gaze full of pity, almost like a sister seeing a brother broken. Together they formed a circle around him, as if they were one breath, one will. The cowboy tried to rise, stubborn pride flaring in him, even as his ribs screamed. But as soon as he lifted his shoulders from the earth, the taller woman's hand pressed against his forehead, pinning him down with surprising strength. Her eyes burned into his, and though she spoke no English, he understood her message: stay still or lose what little life remained. He sank back with a groan, his jaw clenched tight, a rare spark of fear prickling in his chest. He wasn't used to being powerless, and yet here he was, his fate in their hands. Hours passed as the women worked. They lit a small fire and laid herbs in it, letting the smoke drift over his wounds. They sang low, almost mournful songs that echoed across the plains, carried by the wind. At times, he thought he heard other voices joining them, faint, ghostly, like spirits answering from the canyon beyond. It chilled him to his core, yet he dared not close his eyes again. He was afraid of what he might see waiting for him in that dark place between life and death. By the time the sun had risen high, the cowboy felt different. The searing pain in his chest had dulled, replaced with a strange strength simmering beneath his skin. He sat up shakily, his shirt in tatters, dried blood staining his body, scars already knitting where wounds had been. He looked at the three women in disbelief. "What did you do to me?" he asked, voice raw. They exchanged glances before the first woman spoke again, softly, almost reluctantly. "We bound you to us. You live, but not as before. Now your life is tied to ours." His stomach turned at her words, not from sickness, but from the heavy weight of what they meant. He had given his blood to save one, and in return, three had given something of themselves to him. He felt the truth in his bones. If he walked away now, his fate would never again be his own. The desert had claimed him, and these women were the keepers of the claim. The cowboy sat in stunned silence as the words echoed in his skull. "Your life is tied to ours." His hands trembled slightly as he looked at them, three women who seemed less like mortals and more like shadows of the land itself. He wanted to laugh, to deny it, but deep inside he knew it was true. Every breath he drew now felt as though it moved in rhythm with theirs, his heart thudding like a drum that answered their steps. The first woman crouched before him, her hand still pressed to the fading wounds on his chest. "You gave your blood freely," she said, her English broken but strong. "Now the spirits claim it. You are bound. If you die, we die. If we die, you fall with us." Her eyes shone with something that frightened him more than the knives that had nearly ended his life. It was not cruelty, but inevitability. She wasn't warning him. She was stating fact. The cowboy clenched his fists, anger rising in him. He had never lived by anyone's rules but his own. His whole life had been spent outrunning chains, whether they were debts, laws, or oaths. And now he was told he wore invisible shackles forged by blood and spirit. He wanted to spit at the ground, curse the sky, but when he met the eyes of the taller woman, the one who had held him down, his anger faltered. There was steel in her gaze, yes, but also a fierce protectiveness. She didn't look at him like a prisoner. She looked at him like a brother in arms who had yet to understand the war he'd stumbled into. The younger woman finally spoke, her voice softer, carrying an ache that silenced his rage. "You were not chosen by chance," she said. "The spirits watched you long before tonight. They saw a man who would bleed not for gold, not for glory, but for a soul he did not know. That is why you stand now when others would be gone." Her words struck him deep, not because he fully believed them, but because he wanted to. He had always carried a restless emptiness inside, a hollow space he drowned with whiskey and fights. Now, hearing her, he wondered if that emptiness had been waiting for this very moment. The sun rose higher, casting light on their faces, and for the first time he saw them clearly. They were not just three women. They were three lives tied to one another as tightly as kin. The first, the one he had saved, bore scars that told of suffering yet strength, her eyes carrying fire. The second, fierce and unwavering, moved like a warrior carved from stone. The third, younger, carried the gentleness of a spirit untouched by hatred, though her sadness ran deep. Together they formed something he could not name, but it pulled at him like a current he could not fight. "Why me?" he asked again, his voice hoarse, pleading. "Why not one of your own?" The women shared a look, and the answer came from the first, her tone heavy with sorrow. "Because our own are gone. Because men of our blood have fallen, and those who remain are bound by vengeance, not life. The spirits would not choose them. They chose you, Cowboy, because you threw yourself into the knives for a woman you did not owe." That was the proof. The weight of her words pressed on him like stone. He wanted to deny it, to walk away, but something inside him cracked. He had never been wanted for more than his fists or his gun, never chosen for anything but violence. And now here he was, chosen not just by people, but by something greater, by spirits he couldn't see but could feel burning in the marrow of his bones. He lowered his head, his breath trembling. "Then what happens now?" The taller woman stepped forward, her shadow falling across him. She placed her hand on his shoulder, firm and commanding. "Now you rise. You rise as one of us. You carry our burden. You walk with us. Where we go, you go. Where we fight, you fight. Your blood is our blood." The younger woman knelt beside him, her hand slipping into his, soft but unyielding. The first woman met his gaze one last time, her eyes locking him in place. "You cannot return to the man you were. That man died with the 5 knives. What remains belongs here with us." For a long moment the cowboy said nothing. The prairie wind howled through the grass, the fire crackled low, and the world seemed to hold its breath. At last, he pushed himself to his feet, unsteady but upright, scars burning across his chest. He looked at the three of them, not with fear, not with anger, but with a reluctant understanding. "Then I reckon I ain't riding alone anymore," he muttered. The three women exchanged silent glances, and for the first time, the faintest smile curved the lips of the one he had saved. It was not joy, not relief, but something stronger, acceptance. The cowboy stood among them, blood-bound, spirit-bound, no longer just a drifter on the plains. His fate had been rewritten beneath the desert stars, and whether it would lead to salvation or ruin, he would walk it with them. Together, they turned toward the horizon, where storm clouds gathered like waiting giants. Whatever came next, the spirits had already decided. Their lives were one, and the West would never be the same.